Introducing Hugh Sigel is not an easy task. How do you find words to give description to a political icon in the Canadian landscape? As his book reveals, Hugh Sigel has an impressive record in the political, business, and academic worlds. Primarily, I'm glad to say, in Canada. While identified with one political party, his nonpartisanship activity in the name of justice and fairness and economic equity is well known and has crossed boundaries long thought non-negotiable. Hugh, what impressed all of us in the book study Zoom circle was the consistency, the utter, unflappable commitment to see some form of basic income in Canada. Most people have a cause that occupies their passions for a period, but not for a lifetime, with such unapologetic pursuit and dedication. We traced your steps with enormous admiration and interest, sharing your utter disappointments when political short-sightedness, fear, partisanship, lack of compassion thwarted the push for the common good and well-being of Canadian citizens. Your honesty in expressing your frustrations and irritations, they were there, was deeply appreciated by all of us. When, for example, Doug Ford, having made political campaign commitment, canceled the Ontario Basic Income pilot project. He's being sued, by the Civic Liberties Association. While your Senate aspirations and political efforts did not result in an ongoing basic income policy for Canadians, you left us with the hope that one day, if enough people at the local and provincial level struggle hard enough, cry out loud enough, work diligently enough, the dirty, grinding poverty that claims the dignity of so many will eventually be eradicated. That's what your book has done for us. So thank you for it, for being with us tonight, for your vision going forward. We welcome what you have to say and the opportunity to have some conversation with you following your opening remarks. Over to you, Hugh.
Thank you, Hal, and thank you for inviting me to be part of your book club discussion and study group tonight. It's a distinct honor, and I appreciate it very much. You are often asked, why would you decide at a particular point in your life to write a certain book? In my case, I had written maybe 7 other books on different parts of political history in Canada and foreign policy and all the rest. But the reason I wrote this book was really very simple. When I would go around the country, business groups and others, and make the case for the basic income, there would always be one man or woman at the end of the luncheon or dinner who would put up their hand and say, look, just one question. You're a conservative. Conservatives don't believe in basic income. Conservatives believe in survival of the fittest. I mean, socialists might believe in a basic income, maybe the odd left-leaning liberal. Why would you have taken this on and made it such a large part of your life? And so I thought I owed people who asked those questions in good faith an explanation of how the experiences I had been through in my life, my family, growing up in a low-income family, my experiences at university, my experiences in different political and other activities led me to this conclusion, and why the conclusion of the need for a basic income became more and more embedded in my view of our priorities as a country and as a caring community. The other thing that drove me to write the book, and I just as any of you have ever thought about writing a book or deal with a publisher, you'll often hear them say, we really want more personal stuff in the book. That's what people will want to know. Tell us things about yourself or places you've been or things you've done that folks would not know, so they'd have to buy the book to find out. So the book ended up being much more autobiographical than would have been my initial intent. But as I got into it and worked with the editors from UBC Press and others, it became apparent to me that they had more wisdom on this issue than I did. that unless you actually reflected on the string of events, circumstances, experiences that brought you to the conclusion, you really would not be giving the reader a chance to understand why, as a lifelong conservative, you'd be on that particular policy priority. The thing that I have found so fascinating, and I think what we've just been through in the pandemic is so indicative of it, is that while we invest appropriately billions of dollars in hospitals and healthcare and the education of physicians and nurses and in pharmaceuticals and a whole bunch of other things which are fundamental to people living long, productive, and relatively healthy lives, the one thing we could do that would have an absolutely overwhelming impact on healthcare outcomes for all of us, we are not doing, which is the basic income. And so the question that I kept on coming back to in every one of the chapters is, why aren't we doing this? How would it apply in this situation or that other situation? And Hal was good enough to mention the pilot project that was launched in Ontario under Premier Wynne. And let me tell you all how that happened. A woman who is a distinguished health economist, University of Manitoba, Evelyn Forget, Forget, and I invite you to Google her name. She had been the person who decided, after the MinCom pilot project in the mid-70s that was co-financed by Pierre Trudeau, the then Liberal Prime Minister, and Ed Schreyer, the then NDP Premier of Manitoba, that was canceled. It was supposed to go for 5 years. It ended after 3. Mr. Schreyer was defeated, replaced by Sterling Lyon, conservative, and Mr. Trudeau was defeated and replaced by the Right Honorable Joe Clark. And generally speaking, when governments change, they're not excited, the new people aren't excited about embracing the fresh ideas of the people they just defeated. Whether that makes sense or not, neither here nor there, but it's sometimes how it works. So the project was stopped, and nobody, absolutely nobody, had spent any time doing the hard work looking at, well, what had happened during the 3-year pilot project, the MinCom project in Manitoba. Did it achieve any of its goals? Did it reduce the level of bad health outcomes in Manitoba, in Dauphin, and other parts of the province where the pilot was project? Did it have any impact on education? Did it have any impact on the quality of life? Did it have any impact on the level of crime? None of those issues had ever been addressed. So Evelyn Forget, and this would have been, I'd say about 15 years ago, decided that she would, in fact, as an economist, getting her PhD, get a bunch of graduate students who got access through the federal government to the boxes of files, literally cardboard boxes filled with files in a warehouse in Winnipeg, and begin to go through them and begin to do the analysis of what actually happened. How much was spent, what were the good outcomes, what were the less than constructive outcomes, and that piece of work that she did was really the piece of work that said, if you do a basic income properly, you will increase the lifespan of the average Canadian. You will increase the success of a poor family's kids in school. You will reduce the amount of difficulty that the police have in any community where often the vast majority of the folks they come into contact with are the folks who are living beneath the poverty line for one reason or another. And those results were made public. And I remember we invited Evelyn to come to the Senate Standing Committee on Health and Science. We had a workshop about basic income and urban poverty, and she made a tremendous presentation on the outcome of that. And then a few years later, after I had left the Senate, and I was then the principal at Massey College, which is the graduate residential college at the University of Toronto, I was able to convince Evelyn to come as a visiting scholar. So we have at Massey College a bunch of graduate students from all the disciplines who've already been admitted to the University of Toronto, which means they have very high marks, but they are admitted based on what they've done in the community through their undergraduate years to make a contribution to other people's quality of life. And so we often bring in visiting scholars from different disciplines, different parts of Canada and the world, to expose these young graduate students to these folks, to benefit from their experience, and to help the graduate students build networks and linkages with which they can build their own career after they graduate with their doctoral degree or their medical degree or their law degree at the University of Toronto. And when Evelyn came, we of course put out a normal press release, as you do, announcing the arrival of our new visiting scholars, and we listed her name. And I got a call about 3 days after we put out the release from the social policy advisor to the Premier of Ontario. And if you know the city of Toronto at all, Massey College is just across the street on Devonshire from Trinity College, and it's literally a 10-minute walk to Queen's Park. That's how close it is. And he said to me, the Premier would like to meet Evelyn Forget. And so could you come by with her? Which I was delighted to do, and Evelyn was delighted to do. She'd never met Premier Wynne. And they had the substantive discussion. My job was pouring coffee, arranging the chairs, and I was there as a facilitator, not as any great font of wisdom. And the Premier listened very, very carefully, and she said, you know, welfare now in Ontario is not working. It does not reduce the rate of poverty. In fact, the way welfare is structured, and this is true in most provinces, if somebody who's a welfare recipient tries to earn a few extra dollars to add on to their welfare payment, which is about $700 a month in Ontario, just so you have a sense of that, that will be clawed back by the Department of Community and Social Services, dollar for dollar, which means in terms of the percentage of earned income, that's 100% taxation. That's a higher level of taxation than the wealthiest people in Canada pay on their income, which makes no sense at all. And of course, it's a disincentive for people to go out and become part of a part-time or other workplace circumstance, which is going to be helpful to them down the road. So the Premier then asked if I would help design what a pilot project might look like, which I did over the summer of 2016. I remember getting a call from the minister who said, what will your fee be for doing this? And I said to the minister, look, the only thing that will be asked when the Premier announces that I'm the designated hitter on this is how much are you paying this former senator? So the answer is my fee is zero. But I'm glad to do it. And I took the summer off to do the basic proposal for the pilot, which then went to the cabinet. In September, it was made public in November, and the Premier announced the pilot in March of 2017. And she announced it as a 3-year pilot with 4,000 participants in different communities, in Thunder Bay, in Hamilton, and in Lindsay near Peterborough. And each one of those communities was chosen because they had a different mix of people, which were reflective of the province as a whole. Hamilton's an urban area with a mix of industries of one form or another. Lindsay is a more rural area, and Thunder Bay, of course, had the added benefit of having quite a high percentage of local municipal residents who are also Indigenous. And we wanted to make sure that our Indigenous brothers and sisters were part of this process. And what was really interesting to me about that is that in the end, Premier Ford's people said they thought continuing this project was good. This is when he was not yet Premier, I hasten to add. The Conservatives under Patrick Brown, before Ford became leader, said the same thing, and the NDP and opposition parties are by definition suspicious about the government, and that's not a bad thing. That's part of our political system, I guess. But they all said, let's wait to see the results of the pilot. Let's make all the results, good, bad, or otherwise, public for everybody to see, and then we can make a decision as a legislature where we want to go and what we want to do. And what I found fascinating with the decision that Premier Ford made several months after being elected to cancel it all was that, in a sense, he was falling into the trap of suggesting that we can innovate in a whole bunch of other ways. New medical research, new ways of using robots to produce new goods and materials. We can innovate in terms of technology and high technology. But in social service, there was really no reason to try innovation. And that's sort of the old notion, that the poor will always be with us. So why would we try to change that? And in essence, the book, Bootstraps Need Boots, really reflects my answer to that core and fundamental question. When I was much younger, and I was Premier Davis's legislative assistant, so we're now looking at the years between 1975 and 1981. Part of our difficulty, it was a minority government in 75, by the way. Mr. Davis had swept in 71, but in 75, there was a minority government. So the NDP and the Liberals together had more seats than the Conservatives did. At a committee meeting, the Social Policy Committee of the legislature, the NDP made a fascinating motion. They wanted to reduce the salary of the Minister of Social Services and the Deputy Minister of Social Services, not by $1, but to $1, because they were not doing enough for senior citizens who were living in poverty. Interestingly enough, we had just been through a general election, and rent control had come up and a whole bunch of other issues, but that poverty issue was never raised anywhere at any time. So when they passed that motion, the Deputy Minister of Social Services, a gentleman by the name of Doug Wright, really a lovely guy, an engineer and by training, went on to be the principal of the University of Waterloo, came into my office and said, "Huey, they've just reduced my salary to $1. What are we going to do about that?" I said, "Well, Doug, here's the good news. Until that motion passes the legislature, your salary won't be changed. But let's find out why they're doing this. What is it that we don't know about poverty in Ontario with respect to seniors that is forcing them to do this?" The NDP leader was Stephen Lewis, a very bright, able, articulate individual. Bob Nixon was the Liberal leader. And so Darcy McHugh, who was an MPP for Chatham, came from a long line of wealthy industrialists in that part of southwestern Ontario. And he was the treasurer, and his department did a study on the issue of seniors' poverty. And about 3 months later, they brought a report to the cabinet which said, now think about this, in the year 1977, 35% of the people in Ontario over the age of 65 were living in poverty. They were living beneath the low-income cutoff, as it was then called. And when that report came in to the cabinet, and as you will have seen from today's events, no Conservative meeting is ever unified about anything. They'll fight over what time it is. When it came to cabinet, I assumed, and I was there as a junior aide with my back to the wall, listening to the debate, that the left-wing and progressive members of the cabinet, Mr. McMurtry, Mr. Grossman, Mr. Wells, and others would argue in favor of doing something. And the right-wing folks, the small c Conservative folks, would say this is really not our problem. We really can't spend taxpayers' money on this. So the discussion went on, and then it came before the Premier, who would speak last usually, it came to Mr. McHugh himself. By the way, Darcy is alive and well. I think he's now 84 years young and thriving. Darcy leaned into the middle of the table and he said, the vast majority of people over 65 back then were women. Men didn't live quite as long as they do now, so they're largely women. And Darcy said, "Premier, these are the women who waited for the boys to come back from war. These are the women who stood and kept their houses going during the Depression. They're not going to live in poverty in my Ontario, period, full stop. And that produced the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement. And in Ontario, every program had to have a kind of title that would become a word in and of itself. So the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement was called GAINS, GAINS. Just like the Home Ownership Made Easy program was called HOME, right? HOME. But that produced the Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement, which our government brought in. And obviously we had unanimous support in the legislature from the other two parties who frankly had started the whole process. And in a period of 5 years, that number of 35% living in poverty was reduced to 4%. And it was done in a very efficient way. It wasn't a separate application. It wasn't going to see the welfare department. You filed your taxes, as you folks do in your province. You file your income taxes to the federal government, but each province has certain things they put on the form for the Canadian taxpayers who live in that province, where you fill out certain amounts of question and get some support of one form or another. And that's how we determine who should be getting those top-ups, and became automatic. Didn't involve one extra bureaucrat or one extra public servant, but it produced not only a massive increase in the quality of life, but you began to see the longevity numbers, i.e. people who are older living longer than was the case before the poverty issue was addressed. So when I saw that, I said to myself, there is no excuse for us to look the other way when we know what poverty does to people's lives and prospects and their families and their children's educational outcomes. A final word before I'm delighted to take any questions that you may have, including those that were supplied to me by Hal. We saw in the pandemic in the early days, and we didn't do quite as well in central Canada as you did in Atlantic Canada, to your credit, that the people who were hit the hardest were low income, working poor, frankly, people who were working as PAs and others in the long-term care facilities, right? They weren't getting paid enough to get by with one job. They weren't getting any benefits. They weren't getting any sick leave. So as they had to make money for their families, they would work in more than one place. And therefore, they'd take one shift from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, then another shift that started at 5 and went till after midnight. And those people became the innocent vectors of the virus, which is one of the reasons that we did so poorly in our long-term care homes in Ontario during the pandemic. And if those people had had a top-up income, which allowed them to work, so they had enough just to work in one place, then they could have been part of the constructive bubble of safety that we all tried to build for ourselves during the pandemic period. So what was discussed back in the 70s, in my view, is just as pertinent today, even more so, because we've seen what the pandemic has done to people's lives. And I am hopeful and optimistic that the present government of Canada, while not quite there yet, is inching down the road in that direction. And one of the people I give great credit to for this is Premier King of Prince Edward Island. He inherited a legislature which had already passed a motion in favor of basic income under the previous premier, the Liberal government. They passed it again, and they established a all-party committee on poverty, and I was one of the many witnesses who were called down to give our best advice as we could. He has written the Prime Minister of Canada. He has spoken with the Prime Minister of Canada, and I think that in one area we may see some genuine progress very soon. Carla Caltrow, who's the Minister of Employment from British Columbia, who's a very bright and able woman, happens to be legally blind, has been very much on the side of a basic income for those who are handicapped, whatever the source of their physical or other disadvantage might be. And I think she has decided that while there will always be some people who worry about a basic income as a disincentive to work, Canadians would be pretty supportive of letting folks who are handicapped get that basic income top up automatically. And the other point that I would make is that the folks who are handicapped constitute 40% of the Canadians who now live beneath the poverty line in our country. So while I would prefer to see a basic income for everybody beneath the poverty line, my view is you take yes for an answer. If you have to do it in pieces, do it in pieces, but make progress that makes a difference in people's lives. So I'm optimistic about that. There are at least 3 parties that are open-minded to it: Mr. Trudeau's party in Ottawa, the New Democratic Party in Ottawa, and even the Bloc Québécois, because interestingly enough, the first province to actually pass a law for a guaranteed annual income was the Parti Québécois government of Quebec some many years ago. Now, they've never funded it sufficiently to make the impact that they should, but they think the idea is a great idea. So I don't think that would produce any difficulty in terms of jurisdiction, which often comes up. And as we speak, there's a group of former federal politicians from all 3 parties, 4 parties actually, including the Conservatives, who are now retired. They're working with a group of economists and a group of senior civil servants on a plan for how one might implement the basic income in Prince Edward Island. So the plan would be there, and there would be no reason for government to say, oh, we can't do it, it's too complex. Well, they're working on it, and I think it's going to be part of the public debate in Canada, I would say by no later than March of this year, the end of March, beginning of April. So that's why I remain optimistic, and why I think we may be closer than we've been for many, many years on getting this done. And I'm delighted now, Hal, to answer questions and engage with our colleagues online.
Hugh, you raise a couple of issues in what you've just said that pick up some of the questions that people submitted. And one, you mentioned the senior citizens supplement during the Davis years, and the pilot project in Manitoba and Ontario, and now the PEI, which, and at one point in your book, you said that you were not so optimistic about things happening at the federal level, but if things were going to happen, they probably would happen at the provincial or local level. So the question that someone asked is, are we, where should we be putting our time and energy? Are we wasting our time trying to push something of this nature through to at the federal level, or should we be concentrating more at the local, provincial level?
So Hal, my answer to that is very simple. If you look at the history of social policy change and innovation in Canada over the last 60 years, it's always started in the province. Tommy Douglas brought in universal health insurance first in Saskatchewan. And then when he brought that in, Mr. Diefenbaker got a retired judge of the Supreme Court of Canada to do an analysis of what that NDP measure meant for the rest of Canada. And that report said that it was manageable, it was doable, and by that point, Mr. Diefenbaker had been defeated. Mike Pearson was the prime minister. He got that report. And what he then did was sat down with every premier and worked out a deal which basically said, if you bring in universal health insurance in your province, the federal government will back you dollar for dollar for any extra expenditure you have to make, because more people will be able to afford to go see a doctor and to get medical care, for hospital construction and expansion of your healthcare system. And for many, many years, in fact, that is exactly what happened, which is how we got universal health insurance in every province. Yeah. That leads to, for example, the MinCom pilot, because the Minister of Health for Canada realized that the amount of money that this was going to start generating in terms of cost was such that we really had to look at what can we do in terms of investing upstream to reduce bad health outcomes. And that's where the test for MINCOM, the basic income in Manitoba, came from. Mark Lalonde, who was a very powerful minister, Liberal minister, and very close to Mr. Trudeau, was able to get that idea through on the basis of we better find out if we can reduce some of our long-term healthcare costs by reducing the amount of low-income people who become sick sooner, go to hospital for longer periods of time, and live shorter lives by looking at if we can do something about their income problem at the point of initiation.
And
having said that, let me just say, when you live in a province like Prince Edward Island, where there's a consensus across all parties in the legislature and leadership from the premier, my view is that people in Prince Edward Island should be working on impacting the federal government and their federal members. But I know for a fact that the basic income people here in Ontario will be working very, very hard in the coming provincial election in our province, which I think is scheduled for June, to make sure that in those constituencies where there's a narrow margin, those candidates of any political party who are for basic income get a lot of volunteer and other kinds of support to help them win. So you'd have a plurality or a majority in the legislature on side for that change.
so, Hugh, what I'm hearing you say, and then I'm going to, you can be starting to formulate some questions. I think rather than go through the whole series of questions here, I think some of you may want to step in with your hands up for some questions in the light of what Hugh was saying. But what I hear you saying, Hugh, at one point is that when it comes to the question of what are the boots in the title of your, bootstraps and boots, at one point, I think I'm clear that you're saying cash, getting cash in the hands of people, particularly people living below the poverty line, is really the boots that you're talking about. There may be other things, but are we right about that? And if so, someone asked the question, why, because the Kroll report mentioned this, why just 70% instead of 100% of the poverty line?
Well, let me start by saying that the expression you often hear from people who oppose these kinds of social policy changes is, everybody should just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and make a living, for God's sakes, work hard and make a living. And it was Martin Luther King who said, in response to that, telling someone to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps is fine if they have boots.
Yeah.
If they don't have boots, it's just a cruel and mean-spirited way of not dealing with the issue. So the bottom line is, if we can provide everybody with a minimum income that doesn't keep them with any great luxury, but enough to get by, that will be an incentive not only for them to work, if they can, and build their own linkages to the economy, because we have a different poverty line in every province. The new measure now that the federal government uses something called the market basket measure. Used to be the low income cutoff, but the market basket measure says, as the term suggests, if you live in rural Nova Scotia and you have a basket of things you need every month, rent, heat, food, transit, what does that cost? What's that measure in your province? And if people are not earning at least 60 or 70% of that measure, then they're in poverty. And the duty is to bring people up higher on that process. So that would mean, unlike the GIS, the amount of people that folks get in one part of Canada for the top up may be different from what it is in another part of Canada, because the costs of living, for example, in downtown Vancouver, may be higher than they are in rural Newfoundland. And in the Maritimes, for example, our fellow Canadians who live in the Maritimes have the highest level of debt-free home ownership of any part of Canada. And that's because they're often living in their parents' home, or the house was built on their dad's farm. So there's no external mortgage and debt which they have to deal with. And that would argue very much for the need to ensure that you give people an amount with which they can get by, but also encourages them to find work and to link up with the economy, because overall, that is the best answer. The best answer is to reduce the amount of people beneath the poverty line because they've entered the workforce when they can. And as we now know, and many of you may well know, the GIS says that if you don't earn $1,700 a month from all other sources, the federal government tops you up to that number. And so that is a measure which has worked nationally. And our view is if we can get a plan like that operating, whatever the right number should be in PEI or Newfoundland or New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, that would be a very strong impetus for it happening nationally.
So is that the wealth distribution, GAI, GLI? You're saying that wealth creation without an adequate distribution of system within Canada is very divisive. So would a guaranteed basic income be that distribution, fair distribution system?
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the central proposition in the business world, someone develops a new product and they design it and they have a plan to sell it. But if they don't have a way to distribute that product across the marketplace, they're not going to do very well. And our problem is that the wealth generated in Canada is concentrated in a very small amount of the population, the top 1 or 2% of the population. And then there's the middle group in which most of us find ourselves. And then there's the low income group, which, you know, is roughly speaking about 10% of our population, which means 3.5 million or so of our fellow Canadians are living beneath the poverty line, with all the pathologies and negative impacts that will generate for them and for their families and their children.
Any hands up now in the light of what you've heard so far? I mean, there are lots of other questions that we can get to, but maybe it's a time to let you jump in with any questions that you may have. Do you want to just take a moment and think about the things that Hugh has said and give him a time to rest his voice a little bit? Any hands up?
Suzanne White. Suzanne White, Hal?
Yep, Suzanne?
Hand up.
Thanks for this opportunity, Mr. Siegel. I'm wondering if you think that there's a role to be played by educating citizens about basic income. My sense is that a lot of them are kind of curious about the term, don't necessarily know what it means, and possibly by providing more information and raising that awareness, that it could prove, particularly in light of people's experience through CERB and through the COVID pandemic, we might be able to build from the grassroots and gain some leverage in advocating for a basic income.
Suzanne, I think that's a very good point. You know, in different parts of the country, it's called the GLI, Guaranteed Livable Income. In other parts of the country, it's called basic income. Some people the guaranteed annual income, but it's all the same proposition. And the good news is that quite independent of describing what the idea would be and how it would work in Canada, we now have close to 9 major American cities who have joined in to do a basic income pilot. Atlanta, Chicago, and a whole bunch of major cities whose mayors have done this agreement to do basic income. And in Stockton, California, the amount of money that everybody gets, whether they're low income or not, is $750 a month. And obviously, and that's the system they're using is called the Demogrant, where everybody gets it. If your income is higher, then some of it will be taxed back. But if your income is lower, you will keep lots of it. And the results in that place, Stockton is now in year 3, are very, very impressive. So one of the ways, Suzanne, we could meet the challenge that you're arraying, which is making people more aware and educating the public, is start talking about what's going on in other places, what's going on in Glasgow, and what's going on in what went on in Finland, and what's going on in the United States, and so that people can say, well, look, these other civilized countries Scandinavia and others who do very, very well economically, who are very successful in business terms, they have it, and they're mostly smaller than us. Why can't we have it here? And then I think that will produce the kind of pressure. I mean, one of the things we did in the last federal election is we made sure we had basic income people go to all the all candidates meetings, either by Zoom or otherwise, and ask the question. So now we have close to, I think it's 45 members of parliament from all parties who were elected and were committed to a basic income. So that tells us that if Carla Qualtrough or someone else brings in a bill, and remember, Mr. Trudeau still has a minority, so he has to get support from other parties to pass a bill like that, that would be a natural constituency for bringing it forward. And I think like everything else, once it comes forward in one jurisdiction, it'll move very quickly in other jurisdictions because people will say, well, if they're doing it in Saskatchewan, why can't we do it in Ontario or Quebec? We're all taxpayers. We all have the same problems. And so I think that your point of informing people more about it and how it operates and what the benefits are is a very good way of ensuring that there's a strong national lobby that none of our political leaders, frankly, can avoid.
Is that part, Hugh, of being trying to be more persuasive in terms of going forward in our strategies? Like, how do you persuade people about this and providing good information? What I'm hearing you say, making sure that your information is correct, pointing them to where it's being successful. Any other things you have to say about trying to persuade people?
Well, sure, yeah. One of the real challenges, of course, are the folks who say we can't afford it. It's too expensive.
Yeah.
That's a mutual reaction for taxpayers and others to make, and a legitimate question. But here's the reality. The parliamentary budget officer was asked by Pierre Poilievre, who, by the way, is not in favor of a basic income. You would not be surprised to know how much this would cost. If you took the Ontario plan and made it into a national plan, what would it cost? And the chief parliamentary budget officer, who's nonpartisan, said roughly the gross number would be about 80 billion a year. But the amount of money the provinces now spend on welfare across Canada is 30 billion a year. Basic income would replace welfare. So all of a sudden you've brought the net cost down to a number that is pretty sustainable. And then when you look at the implications of less poverty producing less demand on the healthcare system and less poverty, I mean, I'm here, as I told you earlier, I'm in Kingston, Ontario. We have 7 prisons within 50 miles of the downtown.
Yeah.
And 80% of what I like to refer to politely are of the guests of Her Majesty in those prisons come from the 10% of the population who were beneath the poverty line. What are those costs? So, there's a million ways to make the case that this is the sort of investment where the return on investment, both in terms of humanity and decency and the quality impacts on the economy, would be quite constructive. Because one of the things that happened in Ontario when the Gains program brought in and people started to live longer is that people began to invest in seniors housing because people were living long enough to be able to be tenants and occupants of seniors housing for years to come. And that was good for the economy, generated jobs and construction and investment and local tax revenue for the municipalities. So there is a formula in all that which really can make a very substantial difference. And the point that was made earlier about taking this case to the public should address, by Suzanne that is, should address all the pieces that the basic income would actually contribute to very substantially.
Hal, we have a question from Margaret and Eric Tooze King.
Okay,
Thank you.
go ahead.
Thank you, Hugh. I appreciate the opportunity to ask the question to you. I'm wondering if you could identify those groups in Canada who are actually stridently against this, and do they represent a particular sector or a place to address that? You know, like is it the large corporations, the 1% that you referred to? Is in any strategy you need to build both the momentum towards something and also be able to counter those people that are in opposition to whoever's doing that. So who's really against this?
So Eric, it's a very good question. There are basically those who oppose this can be divided into three groups. There is the folks on the hard right who just don't think the state should be investing in people's well-being. The state is there to kind of, you know, keep the trains running on time, and everybody else should earn a living for themselves. And they oppose this as a matter of principle. Another interesting group, which I'm actually surprised at, but it's true, are some of the public sector unions on the left. And here's their argument. Their argument, Eric, is look, in every province, we have a whole bunch of civil servants who are working in the welfare operation, either the municipality, they're all members of CUPE or OPSEU or one of those. And we don't want those people to lose their jobs. Because if you have an automatic top up, then you're not going to need those caseworkers to sort this all out. To which our response has been, look, we're not talking about letting anybody who's now an employee of Her Majesty become unemployed. We're saying that those people can be redirected to do other things which are very, very helpful. And I met with civil servants across Ontario, municipal and provincial, who worked in the welfare sector. And, you know, many of them were people who had graduated with degrees in social work or psychology, and they had gone into government to help people. But the nature of the rules around welfare made them into auditors and policemen, which they hated. They hated doing that. And if you think the annual interview that a welfare recipient has to have with their caseworker is unpleasant for the recipient, imagine how awful it is for the caseworker who has to spend the better part of a day doing that. And then, interestingly enough, the other group are, and this is why we have civil servants from former finance departments working on the PEI plan, are public servants who take the following view. Our job, if we work at the Department of Finance in PEI or Nova Scotia or federally, is to preserve as much spending discretion as possible for the minister and the prime minister and the premier, so they can announce new things and cut ribbons and do the things which politicians have done for years. Because this program, like healthcare, would have an automatic payout once you're eligible, right? Well, then we're not going to be able to conserve all that spending room for our political bosses, so they oppose it. And my view is, if we can invest net 10 or 15% of the gross revenues of the federal government in reducing the pathologies of poverty in healthcare, prisons, bad education outcomes, and the rest, that would be the best investment any country could make. So those are the three groups, Eric, to respond to your question, who usually show up with the greatest opposition to these ideas.
Hugh, I love your comment about investment, because it's part of the persuasion of this for me is helping people understand that this is an investment in the well-being of people's lives. It isn't a handout, it isn't charity, it's a solid investment in terms of the well-being of Canadian citizens.
And Hal, when you give low-income people, let's say, that kind of stable basic income, they don't set up bank accounts in the Maldives. They don't set up, tax limited corporations in Barbados to hide their income. They spend it, food, rent, local services, and that's good for the local economy. So that money actually comes back. And what we found in Ontario with those initial gains programs back in the 70s, that in the end, when you calculated all the tax that was collected on what people were spending their money on, the actual net cost to the province for this new innovation wasn't very high at all. So in that sense, the investment structure, I think, is exactly precisely what is necessary.
Yep. I see another hand.
Yes, Karen Reynolds.
Karen, go ahead. You have to unmute yourself, Karen.
Yeah. Hello. Thank you, Hugh. I really enjoyed your book very, very much. I think one of the things you mentioned in your book, and this is also an objection, and the idea is that if you pay people not to work, they won't work. I guess my concern, one of the things that happened with CERB was that a lot of people got a lot of money, and yet the lower end paying jobs, when people had a choice between going and working at lower end paying jobs and collecting CERB, they opted to collect CERB. From what I understand, I don't pretend to be an expert on this at all, but I'm just kind of wondering if a guaranteed basic income is given, would it not make it possible for people maybe not have to work sometimes under certain circumstances where otherwise they would be willing to work because they have that option?
Karen, that's a very good question. And the head of the small business organization across Canada was making the same concern, expressing it about CERB, just as you have a moment ago. But here's the reality. The reality is that one of the reasons that when we turned on the TV at night, we did not see long lineups of Canadians in their cars in football stadiums going to get food because they didn't have enough money to buy food. As we saw in the United States, city after city and state after state. And that's because the federal government, to its credit, introduced the CERB. And when I talk to restaurateurs here in town in Kingston, who just opened up this week as they're now allowed to, they have all come to the conclusion that the reason people didn't want to come back is because the jobs they had before the pandemic were lousy jobs. They weren't being paid very well. They were dependent upon tips. Often they weren't given stable work hours every week, which is part of, depending on the small business, the nature of that process. So I don't blame CERB for that. I blame the federal government. I give them credit for the fact that CERB not only kept people out of poverty when I think it was 8.5 million Canadians woke up one morning with no jobs because public health advice had shut down large parts of the economy. And secondly, a lot of the businesses have realized they have to put together a better package if they want employees to stay with them, to be part of the commitment and the engagement, which has meant some of these businesses are involving employees in profit sharing and other things. Can I say to you that I'm totally convinced that everybody who got CERB, when given a chance to go back to work, chose not to do so simply because it was easier to get CERB? I'm sure some of that happened. There's 3 or 4% fraud on every credit card you and I use now across Canada. There's a percentage of fraud on health insurance across Canada. So that exists in every major program, but that is not a reason, in my view, to say to low-income people, we want to make sure your income is so low as a working poor member of the marketplace that you have no choice but to work in this place. What we found in Hamilton after the pilot was done in Ontario is that when we asked people, how did you use the extra money? Well, some people took the extra money and went and got a couple of courses for themselves at the local college so they would have more skills to find a better job. Some used the money to move to a slightly better neighborhood where the schools were better so their kids would have better prospects. They did exactly with that extra money what any of us would have done in that circumstance. So I don't buy the argument, and I don't think the numbers hold up with respect to saying that a basic income would keep people from working. Quite the contrary. A basic income, unlike welfare, by the way, would encourage work, whereas welfare now actually disadvantages work because it penalizes any extra income that people make when they do work, when they're welfare recipients. So removing that disincentive, I think, is a powerful thing that makes basic income constructive for the economy, including the small business economy.
Hugh, you mentioned CERB, but one of the things that it does show that in crises, governments can meet the cash needs of Canadians when there's a crisis and it's desperately needed. I guess the question is, how do we get the understanding that poverty in and of itself, which you from the very beginning have gotten. How do we convince them that poverty, the level at which it's at, is that crisis now that we need to address with ready cash in people's hands?
Now, I think that depending on, if you think about federal members of parliament or provincial members of parliament, members of the legislature, depending on the district they represent and how the economics are working in that district, their sensitivity to the poverty question will be slightly different place by place. But when you show them the collective costs of poverty, I've often said here in town, here in Kingston, various business groups, we all hope that, God forbid, when we get that terrible chest pain at some point in our life, and we're rushed to the emergency ward of the Kingston General Hospital, there will be doctors and nurses there who will be able to help us. It doesn't matter how wealthy we are, we're going to need that. Well, if you go to an emergency ward now, and certainly before the pandemic, the vast majority of people sitting in the emergency ward were not there because of a trauma or a car accident or a stroke or a heart attack or a broken leg. They were there because one of their chronic conditions had acted up and they had nowhere else to go but the emergency department. They fill most of the chairs. So if we can reduce the effect of poverty on their health pathologies, so not as many of them have to go to the hospital because they have nowhere else to go, that means that there'll be more capacity for the rest of the population who may need emergency care at some point in their lives.
Any other hands up?
Yes, Sean Redden.
Okay, Sean.
Hi there, Mr. Siegel. My question is around the politics of some of this. And given that the Green Party certainly guaranteed livable income was part of their platform in the last federal election, the NDP, and now there's the private, you mentioned about a number of the PQ that you expect it would be supportive of that as well. And now there's this private members bill that's before the House. So I guess two parts of a question: what's preventing right now something happening? And what do you think the chances are that anything will be advanced with this private members bill?
So generally speaking, when something happens in Parliament, in a minority Parliament, where the government changes its perspective on something, it's because they need another party's votes. And the other party says, we'll support your budget and we'll support this and we'll support your throne speech, providing you put these things in which are important to us. That happened a lot. I give Mr. Trudeau great credit. In the last Parliament, there are a lot of amendments made to bills because the NDP asked for those amendments. And there are even amendments made to bills because those bills were amended in the Senate, where I used to work, sent back to the House of Commons, and the government, in its wisdom, accepted a fair amount of them, something which had not happened in previous circumstances. So the nub of it is as follows. The Minister of Finance is going to bring a budget in March or April. She will have a series of priorities. Part of what our movement is trying to do is to get the NDP and the Bloc to say, well, there's one thing you could do in that budget which would give us a reason to support the whole budget. And that's where you get the point of leverage, if you wish. That's where you get the point of impact, where you can make things happen. And so the basic income organization across the country is working very, very hard with the Bloc and with the NDP and with the Greens to make sure they figure out how best to do that when the Minister of Finance brings in her budget in the next several weeks. That's how those changes actually happen, in my judgment. And then, of course, if we get a province like PEI, where, I mean, I've said directly to people who work for the Prime Minister, if the federal government said, we're going to have not a pilot project in PEI, we're going to have a 5 to 7 year demonstration project. Mm-hmm. The numbers in PEI are as follows. It's about 165,000 residents of the province, about 22,000 live beneath the poverty line. So it's a manageable amount of people. We're going to top them up through a basic income, through the federal tax system. And the whole country can watch and see how that works. And very few Canadians are going to be resentful of PEI being the province that does the test first, because the results, I think, will be pretty compelling. And that's how things begin to spread, just as universal health insurance spread from Saskatchewan right across Canada. That's how I think PEI could be at the center. But those are the things we are thinking about how to make it happen. And it's, you know, it's the old question. People may have a view when you ask them a question about something, but whether that view is salient in terms of how they might vote on the larger questions is quite different. You may have a view, for example, about midwives and having more support for midwives in our healthcare system, but whether or not you're going to determine your actual election vote in a provincial campaign over midwives remains to be seen. Our challenge is to make basic income salient so enough voters are interested in it that politicians realize that moving ahead with that really makes substantial sense.
Any other hands?
There are no more hands. Oh, yes, we have one from Margaret Sager.
Margaret.
Many NGOs at the moment are asking for a just transition, which not only moves us off fossil fuels, but also changes our economy into a caring economy. And part of that is making sure that everybody has a decent income as well as good jobs and sustainable energy field. And I'm wondering what you think about that. And I know that there is a huge effort going on through 350.org and the Council of Canadians and a number of other organizations that want us to not to see that as we move away from fossil fuels, we're also transitioning our society into a kind of new economy. What do you think?
Well, I think part of what our challenge is to define the quote transition in a way that deals not only with environmental and climate change priorities and fossil fuels, reducing emissions and all of that substantially important stuff, but ensuring that our entire population can participate in the economy. And at the present time, there's 10% of our population who can't. They're either on welfare, they're not earning enough, or they're having other problems which get in the way of their day-to-day lives. So the challenge is to make the quote unquote framework of transition large enough that it's not only about things like fossil fuels and electric vehicles and all that good stuff, but also about people. Because in the end, any transition is about people and about their sustainability and their quality of life in their families and homes and communities. So linking those things up, I think, is an absolute priority. And I think it's fair to say that 2 or 3 of the leading parliamentarians in Ottawa and senators from different provinces on the file are trying to move exactly in that direction.
Okay, and I think the just transition does point out that we need to have everybody involved in that and that everybody has the same opportunities. It is part of that. That's my understanding anyway. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Margaret.
Hugh, to come back to a question, a point you raised before about resistance, or someone raised, where's the resistance? I'm surprised by some of the voices of resistance. I have a friend in Toronto, Armin Yalnitsyn, for example, who's a very dear friend of mine, is opposed to GLI in a sense. I have a quadriplegic friend in Toronto who's very fearful that if a GLI comes in, that the assistance and support that he receives is going to disappear. So there's a sense with some that a GLI, they see the two things as mutually exclusive somehow, that you can't have a GLI and have good social support in other ways. How do we respond to them on that?
Well, by saying as clearly as we have that the GLI is not about any of those other programs. It's merely about making the way in which we put cash in poor people's hands more efficient, more humane, and more respectful. and then the welfare system now provides for. And it's not about doing away with special programs for the handicapped or special programs. I mean, I've known Armine for many, many years. She's a bright, wonderful economist. I have a high regard for her. She was elected a senior fellow at Massey College when I was there, much to everybody's delight. But Armine is of the view, and she wouldn't be troubled by my describing it this way, that the only way to help people in difficulty is to craft special programs run by the state to deal with their needs, and that just giving them cash is unhelpful.
Yeah.
My view is when you craft special programs run by the state, you're back into the circumstance where the swells decide how the poor get to live their life. And my view is that we're all citizens. Some may be in poverty, some may not, but the real thing that defines your ability to live in a society is to make your own choices with the resources that you have. Armine would disagree with that, and has said so quite eloquently, to her credit.
Other hands?
There are hands. Bob Lockhart.
Bob
Betsy
Lockhart.
Hogan, Steve Rubé, and Marion Barty.
Hugh, has anyone done a study of the impact that the guaranteed annual income has made for seniors in our society in terms of how that's freed them up for more volunteer work, the kind of investment that's gone on, that we've actually taken a look at it? Or conversely, at the other end, has anyone done an impact study on raising the child tax credit for children in families?
So let me deal with the last one first. The child tax credit, or the now called the child benefit, has been, I think, very successful. And I think the federal government deserves immense credit for it, because it produces a straight amount of money per child for every family of middle or low income province. And that gives the family, and that money, by the way, is not taxable. So that gives the family a whole bunch of flexibility financially, which they did not heretofore have. And the studies on that have been done. They've been done by the Royal Society. They've been done by C.D. Howe, are very, very positive and constructive. With respect to what we know now, that since the introduction of the GAINS program, which spread around the country, and then the federal government federalized it with the GIS, the Guaranteed Income Supplement, that had, the numbers are very clear about quality of life, enhanced longevity, independence, i.e. not being sick enough to have to go to a nursing home or to be in a hospital for long periods of time, and the benefits of that. So there are, in fact, real studies that have been done by independent, peer-reviewed economic organizations on the benefits of that.
Marion.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you, and thank you, Hal, Hugh, everyone. My question is about strategy, and I note that in the chat box, Will Robertson has a note about budget. Like, in order to get anything done, you have to have money, and if budgets are being prepared now, so here we are, some 40 people or so. When we leave here tonight, should we be writing to the budget committee, that link that Will has given on us, and saying get the money in there so that the PEI demonstration project can occur, or what do you suggest?
Well, Marion, it's a very good question. I would say that those people who care about this issue and want to engage should write their federal member of parliament in whatever province they're in, regardless of their political affiliation, to indicate why this is important and why it's important for your part of Canada and for the quality of life and fairness and equality of opportunity for people in your part of Canada. The other thing I would say, and let me just make this point, the basic income movement has reached out to the banks. We have the deputy chief economist of Scotiabank. Yeah. We have the chief economist of CIBC, who are on side with this, have said so, have written papers about this. that they think it'd be good for the broad economy, which bankers are there to serve after all. And so even the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, Perrin Beatty, who along with me ran for Parliament at the first time in the election of 1972, they have called for a national demonstration project for basic income. So you have more and more people on the business side of the ledger understanding that it is not in their interest for the amount of people that live in poverty to be as large as it is, or for the gap in incomes to be as compelling as it is. It's not good for them. It's not good for business. It's not good for society. So that would say that not only should you interact where you can with a local member of parliament, I would not be at all intimidated of dealing with the local chamber of commerce and dealing with those in your area who you think would be open-minded enough to at least have a discussion about this.
Al, we have one more question from Betsy Hogan, and it is 22 minutes past 8.
Yeah, no, let's make this our last question because I want to get back to one little autobiographical thing with you. Okay, yeah, Betsy.
Thank you. And thank you, Senator Siegel. I just want to push back a little bit on the identification of 70 to 75% of poverty line as the line to be hit. And I'm wondering whether there's some kind of broader economic rationale for that I'm not understanding, or whether that's about expedience. It's more, it's thought that it would be more saleable if you say 70 to 75% of the poverty line rather than just reaching the poverty line, however that looks in a particular province.
Very good question, Betsy, and I thank you for it. No, the reason that was proposed, so for example, in Ontario, people were receiving $700 a month on welfare, and the pilot project proposed to pay them $1,350 a month instead, and to take away all limitations on their ability to work and earn more money. And the premise was, A, at $1,300, they'd be getting almost double what they got before, number one. And number two, without any disincentive to work, if they worked and they earned extra money, they would keep at least 50% of it. And when they earned the same amount of money they were getting in the grant, they pay the same level of tax that we all pay on our own income. So it wasn't about selling it because it's 70%. It's about making sure that the incentive to work is maintained in the structure of the program.
You've been very, very generous with your time with us, and we're so deeply grateful. One little question, more autobiographical. I mean, you did tell us in your book of the influences on your life that brought you to such incredible commitment in terms of the anti-poverty struggle that we are about. I don't know whether you can pinpoint any one particular influence above others. Was there one person? Was there one outside the John Diefenbaker experience? Or, I mean, to what effect was your early schooling in terms of the Hebrew school you went to? What influences were there for you that gave you this commitment?
Well, in terms of the parochial school which I attended, that school was structured so that we had the general curriculum of the Protestant School Board of Montreal for half a day, and then we had religious studies for the other half a day. And that would be language, and that would be Bible, and that would be a whole bunch of issues relating to that. But one of the things that was pretty fundamental in all of that was the general premise, which is consistent across the Judeo-Christian world, that you always have to make room at the table for the stranger. Yeah. You always have to make sure that those who are not doing so well are helped and encouraged and given a chance. I remember, I think when I was in grade 10 in the religious high school, where I had to do a term paper in Hebrew, I hasten to add, on the whole notion of what Jubilee meant in the biblical and historical sense. Yeah. Those are the sorts of things that shaped my attitude going in. But look, there are two people in my early years that really made the biggest difference. One was Mr. Diefenbaker when he came to our school and made a speech about, I remember his specific line. It was in the middle of the 1962 election campaign, and he wasn't allowed because he was in a school to make a partisan speech. So he made a speech about working to keep room at the family table, he said, for everybody.
Yeah.
We're wealthy enough to make sure there's room at the family table for everybody. And he said, look at all of us, parents, teachers, kids, I need your help. Struck me. He says, I remember walking home and saying to myself, why would he need my help? Prime Minister, for God's sakes. But that's when I began to think about, and then of course the other person who was so fundamental was David Mcdonald, because when David Mcdonald, before he got elected as the MP for Egmont, he and a Roman Catholic priest in the same part of PEI, Jerry Steele, used to work together on issues of alcoholism and family violence and other sorts of things. And the one unifying reality of all those circumstances was they related to poverty. People living in poverty were the ones more likely to come up against those issues of alcoholism and family breakup and all the rest. So when you look at that, you began to see that we can't probably do everything that needs to be done to make sure every marriage is happy. We can't do that, no matter how hard you try. But maybe we can do enough on the income side to make sure that poverty is not a contributing factor to the breakup of the family or any other excesses which become so destructive for the individual. So those would be the two people who probably have the greatest impact.
Thank you.
Al?
Yeah.
We did miss a question from Steve Brube. And so I'm going to call on, do you mind if I call on Steve to just ask the question? I think it's a very interesting one. Steve?
I think he's muted.
Steve, are you muted? We can't hear you.
My apologies. Hugh, a strategic question. When you started your presentation, you talked about how your publisher had the wisdom of telling you to include more personal stories in your book, probably to sell more. But what I'm wondering is, in terms of selling the idea of GLI to politicians, are we better off to go immediately to studies or more to personal stories? In other words, trying to get them to nibble on that particular issue rather than to bite down hard on an academic study.
Steve, the point you make, I think, is relevant in this one way. When you can go to a local MP who may be a minister or may be a parliamentary assistant or whatever, and talk about specific circumstances with people in his or her constituency and what poverty is doing to their lives and how a basic income would change their lives, you're going to get their attention. And that is far more effective than another thick, study with a whole bunch of footnotes and stuff, which parliamentarians get all the time and have no time to read anyway. So those individual stories are the ones that make a very big difference. And one of the things that I've really been delighted to see is that when the pilot project was shut down by Ontario, a lot of our newspapers and broadcasters actually went and did the individual stories of people who had signed up, volunteered in good faith, were guaranteed that things would never be any worse for them than they were when they started, had this taken away from them and what that did to their lives. I think that was very, very effective. And I think that's still the best way to get someone's attention.
Thank you. Thank you. Marion Party, you're going to bring some expressions of gratitude in closing.
I am, yes, indeed. And Hugh and everyone, it is indeed my privilege and my honor to do the courtesies this evening. And I just want to say to you, Hugh, that if I could, I would say thank you with a toy box with the exact specifications that you described on pages 10 and 11 of your book. Not possible to do so. And thus we do thank you. We thank you sincerely for your gift of vulnerability in sharing how that traumatic experience was a defining moment in your life strengthening leadership for a guaranteed basic income. And we thank you. We thank you for the compassion and civility you have brought and bring to politics and all other arenas. Thank you for your sense of vocation. Amidst all of the vocations you have illustrated many times, when someone genuinely spoke the words, such as Mr. Diefenbaker did, I need your help. In Bootstraps and this evening, you named several mentors. One of them, your wise mother, and David Mcdonald. So you've now become our mentor. So thank you. Thank you for being among us this evening, sharing yourself, your wisdom, your knowledge, and your compassion. So in lieu of a toy box, and with gratitude for the toy boxes with which you have gifted others, I would ask that you please receive our sincere gratitude for this evening, for your book, and all that you do to ensure that a guaranteed basic income is implemented in our country. So thank you indeed. And to the participants, at this time, we, the leadership team of Rosanna, Karen, Hal, Audrey, and myself, do express our appreciation to all of you for your participation, your sharing of insights and questions, and for your presence. Because without you, of course, this Bootstraps study would not have occurred. And thank you to you, Kent and Anne and Steve, for your willingness to be facilitators for the breakout groups. And I offer my deep thankfulness to the leadership team. It was energizing and enjoyable and enlightening to work with you, a bit frustrating at times. And I surely look forward to the next time. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you again, and we'll take leave with that. Again, thank you, Hugh and everyone. May the blessings of hope, peace, love, joy go with each of us from this Zoom meeting tonight. Stay safe and justice focused.